Welcome to another episode of Book Talk uh, with William D. Eerdmans, Publishing Company. Um, it is an absolute treat today to have two Eerdmans authors with us to talk about the intersections of politics and religion. I'm going to let each of the authors introduce themselves, and so I'll begin with John, and then
Sure. John Fea. I've taught for 21 years as an American historian at Messiah Now University right outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I think I'm here today, as the screen says, to talk about my 2018 book with Eerdmans, Believe Me, Evangelical Road to Donald Trump.
thank you, John.
Hi, my name is Shaun Casey. I'm the former Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of State from 2013 through 2017. And I'm here to talk about my new book, Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom, The Future of Religion in American Diplomacy.
Both of the books, one published a couple of years ago and one just published, are creating a lot of conversation about important topics that I'm hearing every day in the news in terms of the way in which faith and religion interact with national politics. Personally, this is a treat for me because I was able, just as a side note, to the voice for John's book, the audio version of that. And I'm also the voice for Shaun's book, which is almost completed and will soon be appearing. Let me turn back to John again. John, tell us a little bit about the book title, where it came from, how you envision it, how it encompasses the content of the book.
Sure. I wish I could stake claim to coming up with the book title, but the book title actually was the idea of David Bratt, who a former Eerdmans editor, who came up with it one day very excitedly. I think texted me. I think I got it. But anyone who listened to Donald Trump, particularly during the 2016 campaign, there you can find video montages of this on YouTube with him with all the believe me this, believe me that, believe me, I'm going to be, solve all the world's problems, so on and so forth. So, I was particularly interested in why 81% of American evangelicals, if that statistic is correct, in 2016, believed in Donald Trump when he told them to believe me. So I think that was the starting point, or the big question that I was trying to explore in this book.
There you go. How about you, Shaun?
Well, it's interesting. I was trying to hold together two sort of disparate ideas, one about the nature of American diplomacy, but also the role of religion in American diplomacy. So it literally came to me, I think, in my dreams or in the night. I woke up and how about Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom? And I ran it by a friend of mine. He said, okay, which Undersecretary of State are you calling the devil? And I said, no, wait a minute. And I've actually done a couple of media with some religiously based media affiliates. And both times I got that question like up at the front, at the top of the broadcast. Now, who are you calling the devil, Dr. Casey? And really what I'm trying to say there is the notion of adversarial. If you literally look at, I think, at the Hebrew term for Satan, it means the adversary. And so part of what I tell in my story were, frankly, the opponents, and sometimes the religiously based opponents to either American foreign policy or internally to the Obama administration. But ultimately, it's the subtitle that I'm getting at. What is the future of religion in American diplomacy? And at this point in time, that question is very much wide open. But that's what I was doing in the Kerry State Department, was trying to help the State Department develop a more sophisticated approach to understanding religious dynamics in context, but also how to engage religious communities effectively as well.
Right. Turning back to you, John. What made you? And you mentioned a little bit earlier about the why you wrote. But why did you write the book? For whom did you write it? And the loaded question, and you could probably talk about this for a long period of time. Did it have the effect? Your book has had a couple of years now that you hoped it would have.
Yeah, I mean, the book, in one sense, comes out of a particular moment. It's published in 2018, so it's a kind of a very, I think it's a very early reaction. It's one of the first Trump books, at least one of the first ones dealing with evangelicals. So it's got a kind of rawness to it, the book, because I'm writing as both an evangelical Christian, self-identified, and I often say, I'm not quite sure how long I can identify with that label. That's a whole other conversation. But I'm a product of the evangelical world, and I'm also a trained American historian. So much of my reaction to Trump's election was just, how could 81% of evangelicals, my tribe, so to speak, uh, vote for this guy or see him as a competent person to hold the office for president? And that raised for me all kinds of questions about the nature of evangelical politics, the serious flaws within American evangelicals and their relationship to politics. And so that prompted me, I think, to explore some of what I'll be blunt, the kind of anti-intellectualism that translates into the way many evangelicals approach politics. So once I got over the kind of initial anger, or I think anger is a fair word for some time. I'm not proud of that, but I was angry. I was fired up that this happened. But I then kind of put on my historian hat and started thinking a little more rationally about all of this. And what I realized was, I should have seen this coming, right? I've been studying evangelicals and politics my entire life. I do think there was something new about the Trump phenomenon, and especially the evangelical embrace of Trump. But I think more importantly, the book is about continuity. It's about it's a historian trying to see that all of the warning signs, whether they be commitment to fear, this nostalgic view of politics, this politics of pursuit of power and so forth, has been around for a long, long time. And Trump, is the latest, most say, atrocious example of this. So I think that's where I was going.
And Shaun, how about you? What caused you to want to write the book? Where did you write it?
Well, there were 2-3 main reasons. First of all, I just think it's a great story. Back in 2006, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright wrote a book called The Mighty and the Almighty, where she described her 4 years as Secretary of State, where if a research question came up that she needed answered in economics or history or civil society, she had armies of advisors to advise her. But when it came to religion, literally, if she picked up the phone, there was nobody on the other end within the State Department who brought academic expertise to understanding global religion and its diplomatic implications. And she said this was just a huge vacuum in her ability to be Secretary of State. And she urged future secretaries to think about how they might institutionalize a group of advisors who brought expertise to our diplomacy. You fast forward to 2013, when John Kerry became Secretary of State. I had the benefit of having known him for 8 years prior to that. And as a 40-year member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he traveled the world. He had a natural curiosity about the diplomatic implications of lived religion around the world. He asked me to come in and launch this office based on the executive order that Obama had issued in February of 2009. And for some reason, Secretary Clinton never pulled the trigger on that. So there was a perceived gap in American diplomacy, starting with Madeleine Albright and continuing through John Kerry. And Kerry asked me to come in and launch this office to fill that gap. So I think one of my mentors in graduate school said that willful ignorance of religion can be deadly, it can be costly. And I spent some time in the book talking about how that just proliferated the cascading mistakes that the U.S. made with respect to the Iraq War. And that's my biggest answer to why we need this kind of diplomacy. But I also wanted to tell the story because, frankly, when the Obama administration ended and the Trump folk came in, they shut down my office, and instead they prioritized international religious freedom primarily for domestic evangelical political benefits, not because it would have an impact one way or the other on our diplomacy. So I had some frustration. I left the State Department in January 2017, knowing full well they were going to close our office down because we were inclusive. We didn't favor Christians or a certain tribe of Christians exclusively over all other global religious groups. So I felt like I was in a position to tell this story. And then ultimately, I wrote the book to try and nudge the Biden administration to rebuild a capacity that we once had in the Obama administration. You look around the world today in places like Russia and Ukraine, Ethiopia, Brazil, just to name a few examples, where religious dynamics are at the heart of those tensions and conflicts. And if we don't understand those religious dynamics, our foreign policy is going to be much weaker than it currently or what it has been. So ultimately, it was part of my frustration to tell the story and tell how it fit in this longer narrative of historical uh, secretaries of state arguing for the capacity, but then also having another president who erased it.
Do you, just very quick follow up to that? Do you envision a future where the office will come back? I know that was one of the first questions you and I were talking about the book. One of the questions was what happened to it, and the next question was, is it going to come back? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I say, particularly at the end of the book, I'm hopeful that the moment will come. I think the main reason it has not returned is that simply the world has gotten even more complicated and conflictual, and the Trump administration hollowed out our diplomatic apparatus in terms of loss of brain power among the career diplomats. And the planet has not been docile in the 2 years of the Biden administration. So basically, it's a lack of capacity to assess the question and assess if they do it, how do they do it, where do they put it in bureaucracy, who do they hire, and what would the priorities be. So certainly, it's an indirect hope of mine that this book will show is something of a primer about how you ramp up such an office, where you align or where you put your resources. So I remain hopeful. Now, I have no insider knowledge, but I certainly remain in conversation with a number of folks who are the senior diplomats now. So I'm still mildly hopeful that some version of it will come back.
I hope so too. John, turning back to you, watching the recent State of the Union, um, I don't think there's ever been a moment where we've been more divided. And actually, as I was watching the State of the Union, apart from thinking about this moment, I was thinking to myself, I wonder what John Fea is thinking right now. The State of the Union, looking across the crowd and looking at particularly on the Republican side, the assorted personalities and figures and different forms of really different, very different forms of Christianity reflected there. Are you surprised by where we are, and is there a way forward?
Well, I'm in no way surprised. I mean, to me, this is the logical result of what's happened in American politics in the last 6 or 7 years. You know, I don't want to be too much of a reductionist here and suggest that, it was just the Trump administration, because I've argued in my book that there's been a kind of continuity for decades in the way in which evangelicals, especially conservative Christian right evangelicals, have tried to pursue power in Washington, and the way that they've done it. So, but Trump unleashed something. Trump gave voice to a certain kind of politics, whether that be tied to Christian nationalism or whether that be tied to the divisiveness that you saw from the characters on Tuesday night, in the State of the Union address. I think January 6th, I think what we saw in the McCarthy vote for Speaker of the House, I think the way in which conservative evangelicals at least responded to COVID protocols. I think the rise of what I've been starting to call a kind of MAGA media infrastructure, siloed infrastructure. I think all of these things are the logical outcome of what happened in the 2016 election. So, is there hope? Shaun, at the end of his book, that he's a hopeful person. I am too. But we have a lot of work to do to try to restore some degree of civility. And, maybe that could be another podcast. But for many Christian evangelicals, it begins with them becoming more thoughtful, more complex thinkers about the world. And that's what I like so much about Shaun's book and his approach to diplomacy, right? As one example of that. What does it mean? What does it mean to do Christian politics? We are evangelicals, at least, are just in a really bad position there, and it opens the door for these kinds of crazies.
John, let me pick up on that point that you just made, and let me bring the two of you into conversation. John, what was your reaction to Shaun's book, and what do you want to ask him directly? And then once you finish, I'll let Shaun turn the tables and press John.
Well, there were parts of, again, I'll speak to where I think our books kind of intersected, at least as I saw where they intersected. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a diplomatic historian even. And I learned an incredible amount of the sort of inner workings of what goes on in the State Department from this book. So I really found it a compelling read and gave me some models to kind of think about diplomacy just as a kind of layperson and amateur. And I appreciated that. There were parts that I thought, raised the hair on the back of my neck. I thought it was back in 2018 again, 2016. I think Shaun's treatment of this idea of the Pompeo State Department with their emphasis on religious liberty, which was really kind of guise for the Christian rights kind of understanding of religious liberty. The section on Shaun trying to get Christian groups on the right to embrace the UN. I don't remember the exact name, but the disabilities bill or the disabilities treaty. I'm sorry. Hearing someone like Russell Moore, since Shaun named the name, also you're hearing like someone like Russell Moore, who has such a reputation for sort of speaking the truth, right, against Trump, kind of bowing to the political forces of kind of right-wing homeschoolers. All of these things got back to my kind of argument about the way politics has so dominated Christian political witness, if you want to call it that, in the world. So I think these were the kind of things that I kind of connected with in the book. On a more macro level, I think, giving an answer as a kind of humanist here, a historian and academic, what I really appreciated what I learned is just how flat, if you want to call it that, for lack of a better term, the kind of flatness of the way religion and diplomacy plays out in the world, right? Islam bad, Christianity good. I wrote a few of these dichotomies, right? Religious liberty good, any other kind of religious diplomacy bad, Israel good, Palestine bad, and as a humanist who wants my students, right, to think, and Americans to think in complex and nuanced ways, this really opened my eyes to just how kind of binary and flat and unnuanced and uncomplex the way religion has been handled in that way. So I think we need more kind of humanistic kind of thinkers who can hold two competing ideas in their head at the same time, to kind of paraphrase F. Scott Fitzgerald. Diplomacy. Really, the book really opened up for me a whole new way of thinking about these kinds of questions that I hadn't thought about before. So I don't really have a question other than thank you. Yeah. I do have one question, if I can ask. It's a very mundane one, but you start the book in 2005, where I think you're sitting in Kerry's office, talking about religion. Why were you in Kerry's office in 2005? I never got that. I was waiting. What were you doing there?
So I actually have a great story, and part of the problem, the difficulty of writing a book, it's in 4 years I accrued a lot of stories, and I couldn't fit them all in. And my daughter says, "Dad, you've got a lot of stories, and you tell the same story 20 times to everybody you meet, and some of them actually have the benefit of being true." So, but so in 2000, early 2000s, Mike McCurry, who'd been Bill Clinton's spokesman, joined the board of governors at Wesley Theological Seminary, where I taught. When this was just a gold mine for me, and Mike and I hit it off. And I was writing my book about Kennedy versus Nixon in 1960 at that time. And McCurry got drafted into the Kerry campaign in the waning weeks of that campaign. And to make a long story short, after the election, a few days later, Kerry calls McCurry, and he said something like, "I didn't handle that religion thing very well." And we could take a separate podcast to parse what that meant. And McCurry, who's a genius communicator and diplomat himself, said, "Senator, I would not disagree with your analysis." And then Kerry said, "Well, tell me how I should have done better or could have done better." And McCurry said, "Well, instead of talking to me, why don't you talk to this crazy assistant professor friend I have at Wesley Seminary? He's writing a book on JFK." And so that's right after the election in 2004. And in early 2005, I find myself sitting across the table from John Kerry. Now, we come from completely different symbolic universes, but we hit it off. We were just sort of this odd couple. And to his credit, he has an intellectual curiosity. And if you say, "Well, Senator, there's another way to look at this," he'll say, "Oh, well, tell me how." And so from 2005 until 2013, we maintained a friendship, and I advised him on some people to meet and helped him buff a couple of speeches he gave on religion. So when he becomes Secretary of State, the first thing that happens to you is an army of attorneys come at you and they say, "Well, Mr. Secretary, here are 10 things you can do, here are 10 things you can never do, and here are 500 things in the middle." And one of them was that he had the legal authority to launch a religion advisory office based on this executive order Obama issued back in February of 2009. So as it was told to me, Kerry interrupted the briefer and said, "Stop." And he looked over at his chief of staff, who'd also been his Senate chief of staff, David Wade, and he said, "David, call Shaun and see if you can twist his arm to come in and launch this office." Yeah. So anyway, that's the short version. That we had known each other for 8 years, and we'd had several. And this book starts with that first real conversation where I'd met him a couple of times. We'd had some very shallow conversations, but we have this evening conversation about how he could do better in talking about his own faith, his own Catholic faith, which was real, but is a pre-Vatican II New England Catholic liberal Democrat. He was never encouraged to talk about his faith in public. And that's where we first had a deep conversation about how a politician, how a Christian might authentically talk about his or her faith in a way that wouldn't be pandering to a particular constituency, but would invite people in across a wide diversity of religious folk.
And I think it's that. So your book gave me a much better, let's put it that way, kind of understanding of Kerry. I came away with, I voted for Kerry in 2004, but I came away with a much more, this man is a much more complex person than, say, the Bush administration painted him out to be in the 2004 election. And I think it's that intellectual curiosity that you're talking about, back to my point before, that really got him in trouble.
Yeah, right.
In his political life.
That's right.
He was trying to say these things are complicated, and, that doesn't work when you're on the campaign trail.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, so, it was because we were successful because he believed in us and he gave us prominence and he gave us staff and resources. And I think he saw it as one of his signal contributions to American diplomacy was ramping up this office that provided a new set of approaches. And I would be grateful to him for the rest of my life for that.
Yeah. A question now for you both, and it's a good question, but what would you say would actually make America great? Leaving great undefined. And I'll just speak with John. Shaun, you can immediately follow.
I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily invested in that question. For me, since we're talking about religion, I mean, you can answer that in a lot of different ways, right? But we're both kind of people who study religion. I prefer to see religion as a kind of role that doesn't contribute to the greatness of any kind of nationalistic experiment, but rather in a kind of detached prophetic role that can speak truth to power. So, on the other hand, I'm enough of I grew up Catholic. I was telling you my biography. I had a conversion experience to evangelical faith when I was 16 years old. But in those first 16 years, there was enough of sort of Catholic social teaching sort of instilled in me in Catholic catechism and stuff to realize that government does have a role in promoting justice, the common good, these kinds of things, care for the poor, obviously, and social and economic equality. So, that came out of my Catholic upbringing. In a working class family in New Jersey in the 1970s. So, and the grandson of a teamster, a devout Catholic teamster. So, I mean, there's that whole dimension of me that maybe informs some of my critique of evangelicalism. But I think if we really want to talk about how we can make more America more great, if we want to actually go with that formulation, care for the poor, social inequality, these are the kinds of things. And I think these, we could spend more time with this, but I think even some of the big social questions like abortion or whatever are tied to some of these larger concerns about equality, justice, care for the poor, the oppressed, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like John. I'm very ambivalent about the term greatness with respect to any nation state, because I see that. I think we saw that in the Trump era. Greatness was a mask for I have political power in my tribe now. Finally, we have what we deserve, or what should be ours. And so I'm very, very, and part of that goes back actually to my strange upbringing in the Churches of Christ, which is a very sectarian, separatist group. I mean, if somebody had asked, "Are you an evangelical?" we would have said, "No, that's too liberal a term." So we weren't even on that spectrum between fundamentalists to evangelicals, to Protestant or liberal Catholic. We were separated. But what troubles me though, how that my former tribe is still heavily seduced by white Christian nationalism, because what I encountered in the State Department from many evangelical groups is like, we actually are smarter and better than the rest of you guys. So you may doing billions of dollars of humanitarian aid around the world, but as evangelicals, we should have a separate entity doing that, because at the end of the day, we're smarter and better than everybody else. And I kept trying to bring them in to collaborate, and some did. There are some amazing evangelical development and relief agencies, and they were great partners. But there are a lot of mom and pop groups that I would ask them, why are you out there by yourself with tiny budgets and you're not having a huge impact? Why don't you partner with other people? And some of them would just smile at me like, "You fool, you don't understand who we are." And I would say, actually, I think I do understand who you are, because that I grew up in those kinds of environments. But I think this is where I think both Obama and Biden are very good at talking about America. Its aspirations are pretty noble, but our record of actually living into those is spotty at best, with respect to race, with respect to poverty, with respect to human rights. And so the world looks to us, I think, for our aspirations, not necessarily for our actual performance in reaching them. And now with the decline in voting rights, you run the list. We have a lot of anti-liberals, in the sense anti-democratic. That's little d folk who, if they are able to take over the country, they don't care about elections. They care about dominating people, particularly on the margins. And that's not greatness in any form, as far as I can see. So I would like to see us incrementally continue to improve on living our aspirations out in real life. And I can't tell you how many times I was in conversations around the world where people would recite to me our failures, the war in Iraq, the decline in voting rights, the rise of racism. And I was not in a position to defend America's record on all of those. But actually, when I would admit, you're right, we are not perfect, and our country will never be perfect, but we aspire to collaborate with people around the world to do better. And we need to be judged on our failure, but nevertheless, we can still talk to people around the world to mitigate conflict, to expand human rights, the sort of humanistic values that John, you were talking about.
The idea of talking about America's failures is taboo, right? To conservatives, I'm thinking here the Christian right, but conservatives generally.
Right.
And I love how the way, Shaun, you there's a few points in the book where you talk about the surprised look on your interlocutor's face when you mentioned, like, yeah, we screwed that one up, or we're not good at that, and they were expecting something completely different from a member of the State Department, right?
Yeah, and I think too, when meeting with religious leaders, a lot of times American diplomats get very nervous and very defensive very fast. And I just, as a minister and as a professor, defensiveness and relying on nostalgia and things like that are never really good learning strategies in my experience.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time. I want to thank you both on behalf of the press and on behalf of readers, for your courage and your expertise in writing these books and creating conversations that are going to go on for years into the future. To those who are watching, please be sure to grab a copy of Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom by Shaun Casey, as well as Believe by John Fea. And there will be links in the description below. Gentlemen, thank you again for your time, and for those that are watching, thank you for tuning in. Have a great week.